Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the book. Now you're going to listen to the Afterword, which tells you what's real and what's fake in the novel. Please remember, check out lupoliink.com and support me so I can keep making these products. I hope you enjoyed the ride.
Chapter 25, The Author's Afterword. I hope you enjoyed the book and recommend it to your friends. I had so much demand from readers and listeners to know what parts were based on fact and which ones were based on fiction that I made this last chapter. Now I'll spill the beans and tell you what was based on reality and what I just made up. Chapter 1, Debtor's Prison. Fiction. Patrick Willis, Seamus Red, Isaac Schwartz, Jessup, Sam Scurvy, William Potts, Garland Willis. Real. Filth and utter lack of hygiene. Debtors' prisons, both private and government run. Smallpox and consumption, aka tuberculosis, was rampant. James Oglethorpe, King George II, Robert Castle. Robert Castle really was a friend of Oglethorpe's and died in debtor's prison for publishing debts from his book, The Villa of the Ancients. Oglethorpe really called for an investigation after Castle's death, and the accounts of the Crooked Guard was really published in the local paper. Oglethorpe really did have a meeting with George II and convinced him to start the colony of Georgia using convicts. The first ship to settle in Georgia for the British was called the Anne, and it landed in Savannah on February 12, 1733. Chapter 2, Out of the Muck. Fictional. Peasant stains on pantaloons. Peasant stains on pantaloons. I just extrapolated that and assumed that's what would happen if you only owned one pair of pants and rarely washed them. The Robin. George Mandrick. Captain Gibbons. Mr. McLean. What was real? Quaker cannons or fake cannons were used to make ships appear more dangerous. Ship captains secretly bought prisoners to resell as indentured servants. The Greek metai, or the eye, has been used for hundreds of years. Icons are very important to Greek sailors. Most ship carpenters were also the surgeons. Most indentured servants served 3 to 7 years. All the positions and jobs on the ship were real, including the powder monkeys. The Yellow Jack was a real flag signaling yellow fever. Enemies' heads were regularly hung from the bowsprit. Very few grown men had healthy teeth and hair. Grog was water distilled with rum to keep bacteria from growing in the water stores. Chapter 3, Pirates Ahoy. The privateer attack on the Robin never happened. Real. Most pirates were dead by 1722, but privateers were still a very real threat. The crow's nest was used as punishment because of its amplified motion. All the navigation devices mentioned were real, but some of the ones the sailing master used in this book would have been considered very outdated. Sailing masters in that time would have had massive sun damage to their eyes. Many sailors are still killed today by being blown overboard in a storm. Sailing in stormy waters is never safe. All the cannon firing procedures are accurate. Shiver me timbers meant a mast was blown to splinters. It also was a term when the mast vibrated when a ship ran aground hard. A jolly mast was an emergency mast made from a broken one. A sloop was a very popular vessel during that time period. Chapter 4, Passage to a New World. Fiction. Mr. Michael and Mr. James. The high-stakes dice game. The key hauling. Planning of a reunion years away. Real. Heavy salting preserved most food on board, but made it very hard to eat. Having enough fresh, clean water was usually the biggest concern of a voyage. Sailing luck rituals included, number 1, a horseshoe on the mast. Number 2, cats. And black cats were considered the most magical. 3. Pouring rum on the deck and in the ocean. 4. Protective tattoos and earrings. 5. Seeing dolphins following your ship. Liar's dice was the gambling game of choice. Dice were usually made from bones, hence terms like throwing or rolling bones. Paper monies of the world were not trusted, and very few people would take them as a form of payment. Gold, silver, and copper were the preferred medians. Savannah only had 4 laws when it was settled. Number 1, no hard spirits including rum. Number 2, no lawyers were allowed to practice. Number 3, owning slaves was illegal. Number 4, no Papist, Roman Catholics, or Spanish Catholics. Number 5, no Jews was an unofficial rule, but it was ignored because the town liked Dr. Nunes. Homosexuality has always existed in navies and militaries, but they don't like admitting it. Punishments aboard a ship included flogging by a cat of 9 tails, tying someone to the mast for days without food or water, and the most extreme punishment was key-hauling. Indentured servants were bought and sold in very similar ways to slaves. The advertisement for Patrick was based off a sales flyer I found during that time period. Chapter 5. Savannah. Fiction. The Auction. Archibald Freeman. Real. The description of Savannah is based off a map from 1734 at the front of the chapter. Savannah did have a dock, bluff, and palisades. It also had a winch crane to pull cargo up the bluff, and most of the houses were all built in the same style. Savannah was the country's first planned town. The town was under heavy military presence the first few years. Auctions and most commerce went through Market Square. The Carolinas were famous for their tobacco, and it was highly sought after. The indentured servant contract in the book was based on a real contract I found during that time. Dr. Nunes, also spelled Dr. Nunes, was a real Jewish doctor the town loved. Whaling was the most dangerous profession of the time. The death rate for just 2 years of service was over 50%. The profession was known to have many black whale hunters because it was one of the only jobs that ignored skin color. Chapter 6. A New Life. Fiction. Marion Freeman. Heather Freeman. Maximilian Freeman. Amos Freeman. Mariana Dandridge and family. Prudence Quinn and family. In the Percival Ward, it was extrapolated that this was where the whorehouses would have been. For some reason, no official records exist on Savannah's whorehouse locations. I wonder why. Most of the first Jewish settlers are rumored to have lived in that ward, but this could also not be confirmed. The Red Lady whorehouse sadly never existed. April Sky. The Bard West Loper. Real. The military would restrict and seize firearms from commoners if they suspected they would be used for other purposes besides hunting. Also, the government would just take them if they wanted the firearms for their troops. This practice would later inspire the Second Amendment. Cornbread was all the rage in the early colonies. New uses for corn were always being found, such as corncob pipes, hats made of husk, and using cobs to feed cattle. The heat in the South forced many heavy labor activities to be done at night. Most cultures in the world split the night into first and second sleep until after the electric light became prominent. Bugs and snakes were everywhere. Savannah was basically carved out of a swamp. Savannah was nicknamed the Scoundrel's Haven. This would also be an awesome name for a modern bar in Savannah. Hint, hint. The layouts of the wards, squares, trust lots, and tithing lots are all accurate. Settlers were also given up to 5 acres on the edge of town to farm. Oglethorpe named the area Thunderbolt because a lightning bolt split a tree in two. The Strand is now called Bay Street, and Thomas Broughton Street is now simply called Broughton Street. Decker Ward and Market Square, which is now called Ellis Square, are still there today. This was the center of activity for trade. White business owners used the square, while black owners used carts in the surrounding streets. During the first few years of Savannah, the government did distribute most of the food. Derby Ward in Johnson Square had the Christ Church, the first Anglican Episcopal church in Georgia. The story of Pastor John Wesley, who went back to England and started the Methodist movement, was accurate. Henry Herbert, Pastor Quincy, and the Sophia Hopkey scandal were all real as well. Heathcote Ward in St. James Square, which is now called Telfair Square, are still there today. This Warden Square had the fashionable and most expensive residential areas. It was also the center of art and music culture in Savannah. Percival Ward in Percival Square, which is now called Wright Square, is still there today. Tomochichi's burial ceremony takes place in Percival Square. Deerskin was the prominent choice in leathers in the South. The drawing and forging procedures for blacksmithing nails is accurate. The upper new squares mentioned in the chapter become Reynolds Ward in Square and Anson Ward in Oglethorpe Square. The trustee's garden and garden tender Francis Moore were real, as well as the Yamacraw Pyramid burial ground located in the garden. The soldiers' red coats were made by a company out of Charlestown called the South Carolina Independent Company. Courting a woman was usually a long, complicated procedure which could involve giving many gifts. Chapter 7. Angry Lobsterbacks in Tomochichi. Fiction. Byron Kingsley, Sergeant Luther, William McIntosh. Real. Queen Anne's dueling pistols were a popular style the century before. Traditional Scottish weapons were claymores, targs, dirks, and large axes. In exchange for their military service, the trustees set up the Scottish town of Darien. The Scots in Darien mainly made fortunes in timber and cattle. They really did try to make silk in the trustees' garden until the winder was stolen. Certain Jewish sects would only eat unleavened bread. Savannah was a huge melting pot. It was made up of British, Irish, Scottish, African, Redskin, German, Polish, Portuguese, and a collection of stragglers from all over Europe. Tomochichi's actual ceremony surprisingly had very little written about it, so parts are embellished, but most of it was accurate. Oglethorpe, Tomochichi, his wife, and nephew all went to London together in 1734. The Yamacraw and Coweta tribes, Sanuki, Tunahowie, Edward Griffin, Brims, and Mary Musgrove all existed. Mary Musgrove was later arrested for being a woman who dared interrupt a conference of men. She was so mad about not being chosen as a translator for the meeting that she got drunk and barged into the meeting. She then claimed she was the empress of the Creek Indians and that she would command them to rise up against the council. Later in life, she received the Yamacraw land of St. Catherine's Island as compensation for her translating work. John Wesley, Benjamin Ingram, Peter Rose, and the Salzburg community founded the Indian School at Irene. Savannah's community also helped George Whitefield found the famous Bethesda Home for Boys Orphanage in 1740, which is still active today. Oglethorpe swore to the Yamacraw that Tomochichi's pyramid would never be touched. Of course it was moved, and the actual location of his grave is unknown. Currently, there's a large rock randomly placed in Wright Square to remember him. Tomochichi claimed to be the proud age of 97 right before he died, but eyewitness accounts say he lied about his age and that he was not over 60. The murder triangle of John Musgrove's servant Justice, Ski, and Estici was big scandalous news of the time. Chapter 8. Fort Mose, Liberty, and Honor. Fiction. Alick, Gloria, Duncan McIntosh, a.k.a. Archibald Freeman, Mr. Edgington. Real. During the Stono River slave uprising, 60 slaves and 20 whites were murdered. Francisco Menendez helped establish Fort Mose in Florida, the first free black establishment in the New World. Fort Mose was a beacon to runaway slaves and was considered the start of the Underground Railroad movement by some historians. England did forbid Scots to own weapons and even have traditional burial services. The English wanted Scotland to assimilate and become British, so they outlawed most Scottish traditions and even bagpipes. The flintlock and firing procedures are all accurate. Worm removal was big business back then. In fact, the modern-day Caduceus symbol, the snakes wrapped around the staff, derived from an old advertising signs for worm removal. The worm winding stick became the staff, and the worms became the snakes. Chapter 9. Dueling at Noon. Fiction. The Duel. Real. Oglethorpe had mixed feelings about dueling. He was losing soldiers and doctors in town over petty duels, so he forbid it. But personally, he supported the right to duel, even into his old age. What was fascinating was, up until the 1800s, many duels were fought with the first and seconds all attacking each other at the same time. It was not till near the turn of the century that single combat became stylish. Oglethorpe had a huge tent on the old maps of Savannah, so I used it in the story. With lawyers being illegal in Savannah, anyone accused had to make their own case. Chapter 10. Jenkins' Ear. Fiction. The Freeman Society. Real. The Treaty of Utrecht did grant England a 30-year edisto to sell slaves to Spanish colonies. Captain Fernando did slice off Captain Jenkins' ear, and the incident was used as propaganda to start a war. Books and papers with anti-government themes was outlawed and very dangerous to own. This issue was so outrageous to colonists that later it inspired the very first amendment in the Bill of Rights. John Locke, Algernon Sidney, and Trenchard and Gordon from Cato's Letters were some of the first people to write about the ideas of individual liberty in pre-colonial days. These writings were not perfect by any means, but they would highly influence the colonial liberty movement. Gunsmithing procedures were accurate for that time. Most colonial guns a blacksmith would make would simply be copies and knockoffs of existing ones. The process of shutting in every night was a centuries-old tradition from Europe. Nighttime was very dangerous back then, and folks avoided going out at all costs. They locked down their houses very tight and usually slept on different shifts so somebody was always awake. Chapter 11. Land Pirates and Battle Rats. Fiction. Lagochi. But I did find his name in a list of real Yamacraw warrior names. Swamp Indian burial mounds. Although they do exist, I could not determine if any were located close to St. Augustine. Garland the Collie. Real. Fort San Diego, Fort Picolata, and Fort Mose were all captured and recaptured. Scavengers or battle rats made good money following around the wars and picking bodies clean. In the Yamasee War, the combined Indian tribes came very close to wiping Charlestown off the map until the Cherokee switched sides and saved the white man. I bet they regret that move now. Hemp was smoked as much as tobacco in colonial days, a fact that most history books completely erased. Hemp was extremely useful, and the colonists used it for food, paper, clothes, ropes, and of course recreation. It was such an important plant to the colonists that some towns required its residents to grow it. Governor Montiano was so grateful for black soldiers repelling a British attack on St. Augustine in 1728, he abolished slavery in Florida. Indians of the South routinely made their war clubs out of gun stocks. Almost half of Oglethorpe's troops died from sickness from the swamps and snake bites during the long campaign. Although collie dogs were not bred to a standard till the 1800s, the dogs have been used to help with cattle in Scotland for hundreds of years. Popcorn was very popular in southern Indian tribes, and they're credited for introducing it to the colonists. The invention of hush puppies to keep their hunting dogs quiet was also credited to the southern Indian tribes. Since only oral Indian history exists on this topic, the origin of the hush puppy is still a debated topic in the food world today. The Free African warriors of Fort Mose did take back their fort with a sneak attack, killing many Scottish Highlanders from Darien and Yamacraw Indians. A Spanish vessel did sneak past the blockade to resupply St. Augustine, ruining Oglethorpe's siege. This caused Commodore Pierce to withdraw the British Navy because of hurricane season, and Oglethorpe had to quickly retreat, leaving all his artillery behind. Chapter 12. Road Agents and Flesh Palaces. Fiction. Deborah McIntosh, Lauren McIntosh, Lindsay McIntosh, Roderick McIntosh. The whores Roxanne, Tiffany, Carla, and Rose. Whoremaster Darden. Real. Old writings talk about how thick the alligator, wolf, snake, and cougar populations were. Also, I found writings that Georgia even had forest buffalo at that time. Again, nighttime was extremely dangerous to travel. There was no light and no paved roads, so it was very easy to twist an ankle or break a foot. Even light injuries like that were life-threatening back then. Another reason not to go out at night in the colonies was the growing problems of organized gangs of thieves. Remember, Georgia was a dumping ground for prisoners, and some of the violent ones quickly returned to practicing their craft. Different size shot was just starting to be used for different purposes in the colonies. The shotgun had not been officially invented yet, but people filled their muskets with all sizes of shot, using them as makeshift shotguns. Rowan wood crosses were a common protective charm in Scotland and all over Europe. Rowan trees were considered very magical. Whorehouses in port towns had many ethnicities of women working. Many prostitutes were forced into service and sold to the whorehouses from around the world. Towns did have town watchmen to deter crime and watch for fires. Chapter 13. Fiction. The Mary Read, The Black Hound, Captain K.T. Brewer, Reagan the Cat. Real. Jekyll Island is now spelled Jekyll Island and was the playground for the ultra-rich. It is best known as the secret meeting place where the Federal Reserve was established. Establishing the Federal Reserve is considered the most damaging event to ever happen to the American economy. Since the USA was forced off the gold standard by the Federal Reserve, the dollar has lost over 97% of its buying power. William Horton set up the first English home on Jekyll Island. Yarrow plants were used as an antiseptic and a painkiller. The stereotype that pirates had hooks and peg legs was well founded. Amputations were rampant in a sailor's life. Hooks were very expensive, and most sailors just made do with a stump. Scrimshaw was a very popular art form back then, as well as using bones to build model ships. The tale of zombies on the Mary Alva is taken from real historical eyewitness accounts. The tale of the first settlement in the New World on Roanoke Island, North Carolina, vanishing by zombie attack was passed down orally by the Croatan Indian nation. Chapter 14. Swamp Swag in Jekyll Island. Fiction. Robert Doe. Real. Privateers routinely attacked ships off the southern coast at this time. Jamestown weed got its nickname when it was used on soldiers during Bacon's Rebellion to incapacitate them for over a week. Accounts of massive packs of wolves eating people were common. Just the amount of iron in a cannon was worth a good amount of gold back then, but an actual cannon that worked could sell for a fortune. Chapter 15. Gods and Freedom. Fiction. Although battle rats could have salvaged a few cannons, It is assumed that the attacking Spanish force captured them all. I could find no records of whatever happened to the Highlander and Indian prisoners at Fort Mose. I took the liberty that someone bought their freedom. Real. The Tybee Lighthouse was the tallest structure of its kind in the Americas at that time. Noble Jones, the Wormslow Plantation, Skidaway River, and the Tabby Fort were all real. Chapter 16. The Crimson Dogwood in Exodus. Fiction. The Murders. Real. The practice of having one's property seized by the government and military to quarter troops was reviled and hated by the colonists. This is why the Third Amendment forbids the practice today. Having anti-government books could easily get one labeled a traitor by the Crown and executed. Chapter 17. The Argyle Colony. Fiction. Captain Mackay, Farmer Mackay, Mr. Perry. The Mackay clan was not in the Argyle colony. Although the clan is now prominent in the States, it is thought they immigrated in later. I also could find no records that anyone named Macintosh ever lived in Darien at that time. Real. The Argyle colony was a large Scottish community located in Cape Fear, North Carolina. The Scottish funeral rites and service was accurate for that time period. George Cartwright and John Cartwright really were Lord Proprietors of a sovereign section of land in North Carolina on the Virginia border known as the Granville District. The free land was stolen by the new U.S. government right after the Revolution and was enveloped into North Carolina. Most Indians did not understand or did not care about the concept of property rights, hence the frequent complaints about them poaching on private lands. Chapter 18. Bloody Marsh and Gully Hole Creek. Fiction. Garland Willis, So Latiki. The poisoning of the English troops at Fort Frederica. Real. Some Indian belts were much more than decoration. They wore a pictorial family history. The bead belt would have been considered very important to a warrior. The retaliation of the Spanish and the battles of Gully Hole Creek and Bloody Marsh really happened. Fort St. Simon, Fort Frederica, and Military Road were all real, and the accounts of the battles were accurate. Spotted hemlock can cause death by affecting the nervous system and breathing. Chapter 19. Pirate Tunnels. Fiction. Bartender Jim Jacks is fictional, but the Pirate House bartenders did really drug unsuspecting victims and sell them. The Three Lantern Pub was fictional, but there was rumored to be residential houses built in the trustees' garden before the Pirate's House existed. Since most buildings were never knocked down, I took the liberty in making this illegal tavern the predecessor to the Pirate's House. Gardner Goldsmith, the hemp dealer. The toddler, Tracy Skye. The caregiver, Miss Bias. Real. The Pirate Tunnel under the trustees' garden. Lots of debate and speculation have occurred about when these were made. Since they were used as illegal smuggling tunnels, no records of them being made exist. Official records from Oglethorpe's letters to England do state he commissioned other tunnels to be built under all of Savannah at a later time. However, I'm taking liberty assuming these smuggling tunnels appeared earlier with the introduction of his alcohol prohibition. The tunnels of Savannah were later used to keep women out of the brutal weather, moving cargo, and for military movement. The darkest purpose of the underground passage was a mass grave for victims of yellow fever. Over 150 sick souls were buried alive in the tunnels to quarantine the outbreak, and it is rumored that the tunnels are extremely haunted. Scribbling rings were all the rage of the 16th century. Chapter 20. Secrets. Fiction. Closing down the Red Lady. Although very sad, it was not real. April Reed and her male persona Albert Reed. Real. Sperm whale ambergris was worth a fortune back then. It was used to make expensive perfumes which supposedly protected one from the Black Plague. Baleen whales were called right whales because they would float and not sink after they were hunted. A combination of English, Spanish, and French government policies created the great pirating scourge. Anne Bonny ran off with Calico Jack Rackham from Nassau and took to a life of pirating. Mary Read was the most famous cross-dresser of the time, pretending to live most of her life as a man. The capture and trial were accurate, but the fate of Bonny and her child was unknown. No records could ever be found confirming she was executed. Accounts also say Mary Read either died in prison of a fever or during childbirth. Chapter 21. Charlestown. Fiction. The Italian or Greek scullery wench Teresa. The German political dissident Miss Bleich. The pearl diver and amateur archaeologist Audrey Scott. Leo the barkeep, Linus the slave, Mary Burley, Anne and Jack Rackham's prison-born child, Julius Cheshire, Nina. Francis and Elizabeth Dandridge did have large acreage in Sterno, within St. Paul's Parish, what was then Colleton County. John Prue was a real lawyer then, and related to Francis Dandridge through marriage of his sister, also named Frances. The Charlestown fortification brick wall with the half-moon battery really did have a building called the Watchtower that was used as a pirate prison. Later, a dungeon would be built under it to store cargo and eventually prisoners. It is now called the Old Exchange in Provost Dungeon, and you can take a fun tour there. The gentleman pirate, Stede Bonnet, did serve with Blackbeard and was hung in Charlestown. All accounts of the Pink House Tavern are accurate. It is currently an art gallery and continued to serve as a brothel even into the 20th century. The Powder magazine was real and is still there today, serving as a museum. Fowling parties were very popular in upper-crust societies and would go on for days. Terraplegia, or the Art of Shooting Flying, was a real book that introduced sport shooting. It became a bestseller and was wildly popular. Anne and John Burley were also real Charlestown residents. The tales of Anne Bonny and her new husband are most likely accurate. Many historians now believe that her father brought her back to Charlestown, where Anne took on a new identity and married John, having many children. Chapter 22. Hilton Head's Booty. Fiction. Mary Read's Treasure. The Indian Spiral Square is not really at the Shell Mounds, although it is a real Indian symbol, meaning the settlement has relocated. Real. Hilton Head did have an ancient Indian tribe inhabit the island, which built huge circle-shaped mounds out of oyster shells. Remains of the shell range can still be seen at Sea Pines Forest Preserve. The Swedish boarding axe pistol was only made between 1703 to 1709. They are extremely rare. Only one place in the world I know of makes a replica of it. Check out the real pictures of it, and you can even buy the weapon at www.kingsforgeandmuzzleloading.com. Before pearl farming existed, pearls were rare and very valuable. A ship of the line was a large vessel, but not as powerful as a man-of-war. Chapter 23. Checkmate. Fiction. The attack to liberate the slave ship never happened. Mingo. Margie the wet nurse. Real. The Florida Keys was originally known as Cayo Hueso because of the large amounts of unburied skeletons originally found by the Spanish. Childbirth was a frightening time back then because so many mothers and children died. All the accounts of Samhain, All Hallows Eve, Bogeymen, Going Souling for Soul Cakes, Lamora, Jack-o'-lantern, and Guy Fawkes celebrations were all accurate and prominent beliefs of the time. An impuissant might be unknown to many players, but it's a real move in chess. Accounts taken from real slave ships are even more inhumane than I describe in the book. Slave ship cargo holds were horribly disgusting and cruel. Pirate ships absolutely attacked slave ships and liberated their crews. I found estimates that 40 to 60% of pirate crews were made up of ex-slaves. Pirate ships were considered the first true forms of democracy in America. The crews voted on all major decisions about the ship. Pirates really did have one of the first known examples of disability insurance through the use of mutual aid funds. Pirate captains did not usually rule with an iron fist because they could get voted out and removed from their position at any time. Chapter 24. Fiction. The final battle and duel at Myrtle Beach. The Pirate House Wench. Isaac and Garland's son Tobias. Real. Long Bay, or Myrtle Swash, eventually was renamed Myrtle Beach. Man-o'-wars were terrifying vessels, usually carrying as many as 40 cannons. During my research on dueling, I discovered that duels by blade and lantern at night were popular during that time period. The history behind dueling is fascinating, and I could write another book just on it. All the pirate weapons, including grappling hooks, boarding axes, blunderbusses, plug bayonets, grenades, stink pots, blades, and firelocks of all kinds, are all accurate. Savannah really did use the ship's waste ballast rocks to make the cobblestone streets. The Pirate's House really did exist at this time in the book and is still operating as a bar and restaurant today. You can see down into the real pirate tunnels from inside the restaurant and take a tour. It's also world famous for being haunted by the ghost of Captain Flint and its history with the novel Treasure Island. The trustee's gardener's house, called the Herb House, is actually part of the restaurant and is the oldest existing structure in Georgia. Order the steak. It is wonderful there. Thanks for reading this book, and I hope you loved it. I hope it encourages you to come for a visit and see some of the locations in the book. Please remember I'm self-publishing, so I could really use your help marketing this work. If you enjoyed it, please tell your friends about it and have them check out www.piratesofsavannahbook.com. Who knows? If I get enough support, I might be talked into writing a sequel. As always, this is Taryn P. Lupo, and good hunting.